Good morning. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to AEI. My name is Aparna Mathur, and I'm a resident scholar in economic policy studies here at AEI. I do some work on carbon taxes as well, and so it's a great pleasure for me to invite all of our panelists on stage that you see today to discuss our topic of conversation today, which is implementing the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, as all of you know, is an ambitious coming together of over 190 countries that aims to provide a global consensus or response to climate change. One of the specific goals is to keep the temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and we're hoping to do that as part of the discussion in this room as well. As part of the Paris Agreement, countries have voluntarily submitted emissions reductions targets, and countries are expected to report progress on these targets every 2 years and submit revised pledges every 5 years. So in a new report for the IMF, Ian Parry and his team discuss how best countries can meet their goals. Can carbon pricing play a role? What other instruments do we have? What other effective mitigation strategies can we follow? And we're hoping that panelists will also discuss the overall architecture of the Paris Agreement and how it might be improved. And all of this discussion, I think, is particularly relevant given that President Trump and the White House has signaled that the US may no longer support the Paris Agreement. While we're talking about the Paris Agreement, I would like to emphasize that here at AEI, we emphasize disagreement and debate, and we're hoping for a vigorous back and forth between the panelists themselves and between the audience. So we will leave enough time for discussion and questions from the audience at the end. Without further delay, let me turn over to Adele with a quick introduction. Adele Morris is a senior fellow and policy director for climate and energy economics at the Brookings Institution. She joined Brookings in July 2008 from the Joint Economic Committee, where she spent a year as a senior economist covering energy and climate issues. Before the JEC, Dr. Morris served 9 years with the US Treasury Department. So I'm going to turn over to Adele and look forward to a good conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Aparna, and I really want to thank you and the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this panel event. It's always a pleasure to be here, so thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. We have a really excellent panel today, and I'm going to go through and introduce the speakers very briefly. I can't cover all their accomplishments and credentials. I refer you to the website for more information to learn about these folks and their excellent work. Our first speaker is going to be Daniel Beasley, who's an economist and a senior climate change policy specialist at the World Bank Group. He was also served in the Department of Environment and Energy in the Australian government. And Daniel's going to talk to us about where we are now in carbon pricing around the world. And if you haven't seen it, the World Bank puts out a periodical report called State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. And it's a really interesting compendium of where and how countries price carbon. After Daniel, Ian Parry from the International Monetary Fund is going to talk to us. He is the principal environmental fiscal policy expert at the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and they do terrific work on looking at the value to countries of controlling carbon emissions, including all the other external costs that can be addressed through carbon pricing policies. Ian's going to talk to us today about some tools that they're building there at the IMF that countries can use to assess their policy options as they go to implement their Paris commitments. And so we'll be hearing some of the new and latest work that the IMF is doing. And after Ian speaks, we'll hear from Joe Aldi. Joe is an associate professor in public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. He also has affiliations with Resources for the Future, NBER, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Joe's going to be talking to us. Oh, he also served for 2 years in the Obama administration, working on energy and environment at the White House. Joe's going to talk to us about the important role for transparency in the Paris Climate Agreement and why it's helpful that countries are forthright about the ambition of their pledges, but some of the trade-offs that can come with that when they go to implement their policies domestically. And then Marina's going to close us out here. Maureen Cropper is the chair of the economics department at the University of Maryland, and she has an appointment as a senior fellow at Resources for the Future and a long career of tremendous public and academic service. Maureen's research has been lately around the co-benefits of controlling greenhouse gases. So when we reduce carbon emissions, it means we're also reducing other air pollutants, and there are enormous potential human health benefits to those co-pollutants. And I, for one, think this is a topic that doesn't get enough attention. And so Maureen's going to tell us a little bit about those potential benefits, and I personally encourage everybody to think about those benefits when they think about the potential implementations of the Paris commitments and other policy developments. So, Daniel, why don't you start us off? And each speaker is going to have 10 minutes, and then we'll have a little discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up to you folks. So think about the questions that you might want to ask.
Thank you, Adele. As Adele mentioned, my name is Daniel Besley. I work at the World Bank, and today I'll give you an overview of the status of carbon pricing around the world and some of the trends that we're seeing. This first slide shows a map from the report that Adele mentioned, the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. This map we update annually. It's available on our website and also in the report that we publish. And it shows where across the world countries are either considering carbon pricing, are scheduling it for implementation, or have implemented carbon pricing. To date, 45 national and 25 subnational jurisdictions are putting a price on carbon. The number of carbon pricing initiatives implemented or scheduled for implementation has quadrupled over the past decade and almost doubled over the past 5 years. This graph shows the percentage on the vertical axis, the percentage of global annual greenhouse gas emissions covered by carbon pricing systems. And you can see the growth over the past couple of decades. We're now sitting at 51 carbon pricing systems globally. Interestingly, there's 26 carbon taxes and 25 emissions trading schemes. They cover around 11 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, or about 20% of global greenhouse gases if we include China's projected power sector ETS in 2020. In terms of latest developments in carbon pricing, all the most recent, so over the past year, developments in carbon pricing have been in the Americas region. We've seen Alberta bring in a carbon tax on combustion emissions, not covered by its baseline credit system. Chile has brought in a carbon tax on power and industrial sector. Colombia has brought in a carbon tax on liquid and gaseous fuels. Ontario has brought in an ETS. But there are some concerns now that they might wind back that ETS. Washington State is in the early stages of introducing a baseline credit scheme for their non-emission intensive and trade exposed industrials. There's an ETS in Massachusetts in the power sector, and Argentina has now passed a law to bring in a carbon tax. There are also encouraging developments, such as China's announcement end of last year that it will bring in a national ETS in its power sector in 2020. Mexico has now legislated. It already has a carbon tax. It has now legislated a requirement for it to bring in an emissions trading scheme. Kazakhstan has reinstated its emissions trading scheme after a pause to review its policy design, and Singapore has now legislated that it will bring in and start a carbon tax from 2019. In terms of prices in carbon prices around the world range from less than $1 to $139 a tonne CO2. Many schemes saw prices rise in 2018 compared to 2017. The most substantial being a rise in the EUA price. We're now seeing permits from the European ETS up at around 20 euros. Half the emissions covered by carbon pricing systems are now with systems that have prices above $10 a tonne, compared to only a quarter last year. That being said, prices are still way too low compared to what we need to see. But those rising prices have led to an increase in the revenues that carbon pricing systems have raised around the world. This graph shows on the vertical axis the price in those systems, and on the horizontal axis the proportion of the jurisdiction's emissions that that carbon pricing system covers, and the size of the circle is the amount of revenue. In 2017, governments raised around $33 billion in carbon pricing revenues, and this is a 50% increase compared to 2016, which is around $22 billion. The main reasons for this have been auction revenues from new ETSs, such as that in Ontario, revenues from the new taxes, so Alberta, Chile and Colombia, an increase in the tax rate in the carbon taxes in France and Switzerland, and particularly given its size, the increase in the EUA price, the size of the scheme. This next slide just points out those schemes that have had significant increases in revenue. However, the prices are still too low. So according to the High Level Commission on Carbon Pricing, which is a group brought together by the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition and chaired by Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz, they put out a report recently that said that to be consistent with the Paris Agreement and the 2-degree goal, prices in carbon pricing systems need to be around $40 to $80 in 2020 and $50 to $100 in 2030. So there's still a long way to go on the pricing side. There have been some developments internationally. So looking forward, there is great potential with the implementation of NDCs, as 88 parties mention carbon pricing in their NDCs, and these countries represent 56% of global greenhouse gas emissions. At the international level, there's been some movement in international aviation and shipping as well. 73 countries representing 88% of international aviation activity have said that they will join the voluntary part of the CORSIA agreement, which is an offsetting program for international aviation. International Maritime, the International Maritime Organisation has now said that they will look to drive emissions down and have a long-term goal of putting international maritime emissions on a pathway to reach the 2-degree goal. In terms of some of the trends we're seeing in carbon pricing around the world, carbon pricing initiatives, we're seeing a lot of carbon pricing initiatives now come forward as part of a package that promotes, part of a broader environmental package, part of a package that promotes benefits beyond climate change. And we'll see some of the later presentations talk about some of those co-benefits. Many jurisdictions incorporate a phased approach. This is nothing new, but it's certainly something that has continued when implementing carbon pricing systems. Many jurisdictions take a phased approach to both coverage and pricing as well. There are innovative tools and technologies that will help support the development of the next generation of carbon markets. For example, innovations in data gathering through, say, satellites. For example, satellites and sensors will help monitor emissions and air pollution. Developments such as distributed ledger technology, such as blockchain, could help reduce transaction costs associated with the trading credits and permits, which could help more countries and more projects be involved in international trade. We're also seeing momentum for climate-related financial disclosure and increased recognition of climate change as a material risk to financial stability. This led the G20 to establish a task force on climate-related financial disclosure, which has really led this agenda, and one of its recommendations is the use of and disclosure of internal carbon pricing as a means to manage these risks. There's also been momentum to phase out some of the countervailing policies, such as subsidies on fossil fuels. The subsidies for fossil fuels vastly outweighs the amount of positive carbon prices. And there have been some good developments, particularly, say, in Indonesia and Iran, for example, some in India, but a lot more needs to be done on phasing out those kind of negative carbon prices. There's also been growth in the movement to divest from fossil fuels and carbon-intensive assets. So, for example, the Divest Invest initiative or the Portfolio Decarbonisation Coalition, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition overseeing the decarbonisation of $800 billion in assets under management. There's some of the trends we're seeing in carbon pricing around the world. I just wanted to point out that all the data that I've shown in the graphs that are in this presentation today are available on our website, and you can access all the data around prices and coverage and details around the schemes around the world on the carbon pricing dashboard.worldbank.org, and all the details are also in our annual report, also available on the World Bank's website. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to say a few remarks about a new IMF working paper that's just come out called Mitigation Policies for the Paris Agreement, an Assessment for G20 Countries. So a typical pledge amongst G20 countries for the Paris Agreement, and G20 countries account for about 80% of global emissions. But a typical mitigation pledge for these countries is to cut emissions by something in the ballpark of about 30% by 2030 relative to emissions in some baseline year. At the fund, we think that carbon pricing has a central role to play in implementing these mitigation pledges. It's environmentally effective in the sense that it provides across-the-board incentives to reduce energy use and shift towards cleaner fuels. It can mobilize substantial new revenues, which can be used, for example, to cut other taxes or lower fiscal deficits. And it can be easy from an administrative perspective, for example, building in carbon charges into existing systems of fuel taxes. But we also know that carbon pricing can be politically challenging, not least because of its first-order impact on energy prices. So at the fund, we think it's especially useful to have country-level assessments of the environmental, the fiscal, and the economic impacts of carbon pricing, and also quantitative analysis of the trade-offs between carbon pricing and other mitigation instruments that are commonly implemented, because this sort of information helps to inform policy design at a domestic level, and it also informs dialogue at the international level on revisions to mitigation pledges. So at the IMF, my colleague Victor Mylonas has been developing spreadsheet tools to try and provide this sort of information on a country-by-country basis. And these spreadsheet tools start out for a particular country with use of fossil and non-fossil fuels in the power sector, the transport sector, the household sector, and the industrial sector. And then we project fuel use by sector forward using projections of GDP, assumptions about how higher GDP affects the demand for energy, assumptions about the rates of improvement in energy efficiency, and so on. And then the impacts of carbon pricing and other mitigation policies will hinge on the price responsiveness of fuel use in different sectors. And we base these assumptions on empirical evidence and results that emerge from much more sophisticated energy models. So we think that some of the attractions of this highly streamlined approach are that we can easily incorporate a wide range of countries, a wide range of policies, a wide range of alternative parameter scenarios, and the analysis is very transparent. We can easily explain the differences across policies and across countries in terms of basic economic concepts that are familiar to policymakers. Of course, there are numerous caveats with a highly streamlined analysis. These are only providing first-pass assessments For example, we don't take into account the impact of mitigation policies, the feedback effect on international energy prices. We're not looking at the gradual turnover of capital, which diminishes fuel price responsiveness in the nearer term, and so on. This figure shows our projections in the business as usual case, where there are no new mitigation policies beyond those implicit in current fuel use between 2015 and 2030. The blue bars are the percentage change in GDP, which is substantial in China, over 100%, even bigger in India, over 200%. But the red bars indicate the decline in the energy intensity of GDP, which is between about 20 and 40% across different countries, and that's driven by improving energy efficiency, the dampening effect on energy demand from gradually rising international energy prices, and our assumption that energy demand grows slower than growth in GDP. So the net impact on CO2 emissions is given by the black boxes. So for the G20 group as a whole, emissions are projected to increase by about 35% out to 2030, but emissions growth is much more substantial, for example, in India at over 100%. In this figure, the black squares now are the percentage reduction in CO2 emissions below business as usual levels in 2030 that would result if countries were to meet the pledges for the Paris Agreement. And the blue bars are the percentage reduction in 2030 emissions below business as usual that would be induced by introducing a $35 per ton carbon price in 2030. And the red bars are the extra CO2 reductions from phasing in a $70 per ton carbon price by 2030. So the very bottom bar is indicating that on average for the G20 as a whole, countries would meet their mitigation pledges with a $35 per ton carbon price. In China, that would be way more than sufficient to meet their mitigation pledge, and the same for India. But in the United States, and China and India account for the huge, a disproportionately large share of emissions in 2030. But, for example, for the United States and Turkey, they would require emissions prices more in the order of about $70 per ton to meet their pledges. And for a number of other countries, $70 per ton falls well short of what would be needed. For example, in Australia, Canada, Korea, and European countries. And this difference in the prices that are implicit in countries' mitigation pledges reflects not only differences in the stringency of those pledges, indicated by differences in the black squares across countries, but also differences in the price responsiveness of emissions across countries, indicated by differences in the lengths of the blue and red bars. In particular, in countries that consume a lot of coal, emissions are a lot more responsive to pricing than in other countries. So that's why we have long bars, for example, for China, India, and South Africa. If G20 countries were to phase in a $70 per ton carbon price by 2030, this would be mobilizing substantial amounts of revenue, typically between about 1 and 2.5% of GDP, and substantially more than that in some countries like India, Russia, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. In this figure, the red bars indicate the economic costs of carbon pricing, essentially the value of the foregone fossil fuel consumption. And these are actually pretty modest in most cases, even for the $70 per ton carbon price, less than 0.5% of GDP. But in some cases, China, India, and South Africa, these economic costs are more substantial, between about 1 and 1.5% of GDP. But the blue bars indicate the domestic environmental co-benefits of carbon pricing, reductions in air pollution deaths, reductions in traffic congestion, traffic accident, externalities, and so on, minus the economic costs. And in the majority of cases, these blue bars are either approximately zero or significantly positive, indicating that for the majority of countries, they can move ahead unilaterally with carbon pricing and at least up to a point, they're no worse off. And in some cases, particularly China, where there are very large air pollution benefits, they can be significantly better off accounting for the domestic environmental benefits, but not even accounting for the global climate benefits. Although I know Maureen's going to come back on this issue of how we valued air pollution benefits in lower income countries like India. This table is comparing the effectiveness of other mitigation instruments at cutting CO2 emissions compared with the broad-based carbon tax or broad-based carbon pricing policy, where other policies are scaled such that they impose the same price on CO2 emissions for the emissions that they cover compared with the carbon tax. And the first column shows that in coal-intensive countries, then imposing just a tax on coal use rather than on all fossil fuels has an effectiveness of 75% or more of that of a carbon tax. For example, in Australia, China, Germany, India, Korea, and South Africa. But obviously in countries that consume a lot less coal, coal taxes are relatively less effective relative to a carbon tax. In the second column, we see that an emissions trading system here assumed just to apply to the power sector and to large industry, but not to the transport sector or households and buildings, that has effectiveness of about 50 to 70% of a completely comprehensive carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme. A tax on electricity CO2 emissions is nearly as effective as an emissions trading system, but a tax on electricity output is significantly less effective because that's not promoting fuel switching within the power sector. Road fuel taxes are a relatively weak instrument. In fact, their effectiveness is only about 5% of that of a broad carbon pricing policy. That's partly because road fuel taxes are covering only a minor portion of economy-wide emissions, but in addition, carbon charging has a much smaller proportionate impact on road fuel prices than it does on, for example, prices of coal. And then the final columns indicating that if we had a broad policy to improve energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy with the same implicit price on CO2 emissions, then that's cutting emissions by about 20 to 40% of that of a broad-based carbon pricing policy. This last table is comparing the revenue potential of other mitigation instruments relative to a broad-based carbon tax or pricing policy. And basically, no other policy comes anywhere near close to mobilizing the same amount of new revenue as a carbon tax because all the other policies are focused on a much narrower tax base. So even if in emissions trading systems assumed to apply only to the power and large industry sector, all of the allowances were auctioned, we're only going to be raising revenues of about 30 to 50% of revenues that would be raised under a fully comprehensive carbon pricing policy. So just to sum up, there are three main themes of the analysis. Not necessarily novel, but I think it's important to have these fleshed out quantitatively on a country-by-country basis. We've seen that there's a strong environmental, fiscal, and economic advantage of broad-based carbon taxes or equivalent trading systems that cover all emissions, not just power and large industry. So we think that a carbon tax or equivalent pricing policy should be the centerpiece of mitigation efforts. And we've also seen that unilateral action can actually be in some countries' own domestic interests if the domestic environmental benefits outweigh the mitigation costs. Or at least when you take into account domestic environmental benefits, they offset a substantial portion, or more than offset a substantial portion of the economic costs. Second, we've seen that in some countries, quite high carbon prices are needed to be consistent with mitigation pledges. That's just because the demand for fossil fuels is relatively price inelastic. So in some countries, they will need quite high prices, carbon prices. So to make carbon pricing more politically acceptable, perhaps we need to reduce the pressure on carbon pricing by using complementary measures, most obviously expanding infrastructure for renewables, electric vehicles, perhaps using some other instruments that promote some of the behavioral responses that carbon pricing would promote, but with a much smaller impact on energy prices. And then thirdly, we've seen that there are wide cross-country differences in the prices needed to meet mitigation pledges, which, in our view, underscores the need for complementing the Paris process with a carbon price floor arrangement amongst the large emitting countries. This would guarantee a minimum level of effort amongst participating countries. It would provide some reassurance against losses in competitiveness. And also, even countries like perhaps India that would, for whom the price floor would more than meet their mitigation pledge, might be enticed to join this type of arrangement because through provisions of the Paris Agreement, they can trade excess mitigation credits with other countries and make themselves better off.
Great, thank you, Ian.
Perfect. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me thank Aparna and her colleagues for hosting us here at AEI. It's my first time in this space, and it's a wonderful space to talk about climate policy and the potential role that pricing carbon can play in climate policy. I want to think about this, as was noted at the top, about the challenge we face in trying to deliver on the ambitious goals that countries have agreed to try to limit warming to well below 2 degrees C. How do we think about pricing carbon in that 2 degrees C world, and what are some of the political economy challenges to doing that? So first I want to talk a little bit about the Paris Pledge and Review framework. It's already been alluded to in some of the initial presentations. I'll then discuss some about how to think about the role of transparency, multilateral transparency, how it might facilitate greater ambition over time, and why this is sort of the key premise of the Pledge and Review approach that countries agreed to in 2015 in Paris. But then I'm going to contrast that with some of the challenges when we think about transparency in the domestic context, when we think about carbon pricing, and sort of illustrate what I think is a bit of a tension between an enthusiasm for transparency in the multilateral context, but sometimes a less than enthusiastic response among domestic stakeholders when they think about transparency in pricing carbon, a kind of climate transparency conundrum I think you'll see between the domestic and multilateral context. So first, the Paris Pledge and Review framework. In Paris, we have these pledges of mitigation effort, mitigation goals. Virtually every country in the world has put forward a voluntary pledge. It is truly voluntary. There is nothing binding on them like we had in the old regime under Kyoto from the 1997 UN climate negotiations. And they take many different forms. And so some of the countries have said, here's what our emissions were, say, in 1990 or 2005. We're going to reduce our emissions some percentage below that. Others have said, we forecast our emissions out to 2030, and we're going to take a percentage reduction from that. Several large economies like China and India have said we're going to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP. Others have said we're going to reduce the share of fossil energy in our economy. And still others have said we're going to have a peak year. And of course, there's a number of countries that have used a combination of these. And it creates a kind of apples and oranges problem when you think about trying to assess or evaluate what countries are doing. It's very difficult to assess the stringency of the effort or the ambition of the effort intended by these countries by the way they have chosen the type of pledge by which they represent what they're going to do to mitigate emissions. This is why I think the transparency in the Paris Agreement is quite important. So the model here is sort of pledge and review. And in Paris, there was a lot of agreement on what the pledges were going to be. They were made in the year leading up to the Paris talks in late 2015. But what we would do to actually review those pledges is still part of ongoing negotiations. In fact, part of what is a number of negotiators aspire to achieve in the UN climate talks at the end of this year. But how we think about evaluating, reviewing, assessing these pledges is going to be critical, I think, to demonstrate the sort of credibility with which countries have implemented their pledges, demonstrate for countries whether their peers are stepping forward, their neighbors, their trade partners are stepping forward and undertaking comparable action. And so this transparency in the Paris Agreement is going to require a number of elements. One will be supplying information. And the good news here is this isn't something that we have to think about wholly new. This is something we've done in a number of international agreements, a number of contexts. In fact, it's quite common to think about the role of international institutions to play this role of compiling information, analyzing the information, and disseminating it so that there's sort of a common understanding across all the parties to the agreement about what countries are doing. In fact, the IMF has been doing this a long time with its Article 4 consultations, where they review the economic policies of countries. The World Bank has done this with a lot of their evaluations of countries, so that we can understand what kind of policies countries are actually implementing and what kind of impact they have. Of course, part of this is going to be a role not just for an international institution, but for the countries, the members participating in the agreement, to report on their own and to provide information that can then be used by those who are analyzing it and trying to compile it and trying to construct an apples-to-apples comparison. There will be a technical review that's envisioned as well, so that we can sort of dig down a little bit and bring in the eggheads to really understand what countries are reporting on. And all this will help feed into a process both to understand what is the aggregate impact of what we're doing through a sort of global stock taking, and to help that inform what will be a periodic review and updating of mitigation pledges. So most people have said coming out of Paris, we're not doing enough for 2 degrees C. I've seen very little evidence since then that suggests we're really on a path to 2 degrees C. But we're taking a first step. It's clearly a much broader step than what we've taken in the past by engaging virtually every country in the world. And for a lot of countries, taking a much more ambitious step than what they had done previously. But this kind of system of transparency, or what sometimes gets referred to as policy surveillance, can actually help us understand what everyone's doing, how it all adds up, and how much more we need to do if we're going to stay on a path to 2 degrees C. So with that, let me talk a little bit about multilateral transparency, why it matters. For one thing, it's going to be, I think, critical when we think about this updating process for countries to really think about not just what you've pledged in the past, but what you're designing in domestic policy. That's what's actually binding. There's been talk for 30 years about how to do a sort of legally binding international agreement. We don't have one. We're not going to have one. It's very difficult to imagine having one. But what is binding will be the domestic policies that national governments actually implement. And so that's the kind of thing that will actually inform the understanding of those policies, and the outcomes of those policies will inform this global stock taking. It will help feed into the nature of the negotiating dynamic, where there will be some role for naming and shaming. We've seen in other contexts that occasionally naming and shaming actually does have some impact. You are raising political cost on leaders for them to have to face criticism for the fact that their country's not delivering on what they said they were going to do previously. There's a little bit of reputational risk here. This isn't like a financial penalty we're imposing on a country that we think may have a strong deterrent effect, but there is evidence in the scholarship by legal scholars and experts in international relations that naming and shaming can sort of nudge countries to do a little bit more. And that may help us enhance the ambition of future mitigation pledges. I think the other thing that's really critical about this system of transparency is it creates this opportunity for learning about what policies work. Part of the resistance by countries on trying to take on more ambitious mitigation goals is they're not sure how to implement those goals in their own countries. So as we go forward with this system of transparency, we can actually learn what policies work in different kinds of economic and legal contexts. Okay. Cap and trade may work in some countries. A carbon tax may work well in others. It may be a regulatory approach, may be more appealing in still a third type of country. Learning what the performance of climate policy through the system of transparency will help us understand how to design the next round of domestic policy that's going to be the key to delivering on the next round of mitigation pledges. I think there's a kind of political economy about this kind of supplying of information that is important to think about when we think about a lot of the stakeholders who engage in both the multilateral talks but also the design of domestic policy. So one, I think there's an interest among those in the environmental community to demand information about what countries are doing because they want to be able to identify and celebrate the leaders who are really doing significant actions, making significant investments, implementing meaningful policies to drive down their emissions. But they also want to have information about those who maybe all talk and haven't really delivered on their mitigation goals and being able to identify those laggards to target for taking additional action. Those in the business community and industry groups are going to be quite interested in this information as well. It will matter in how they think about the competitiveness impacts of the implementation of these mitigation pledges. It'll allow them to also think about how to best shape cost-effective and ambitious domestic policy programs. I think it's important when we think about this, the role that carbon pricing can play in this. It's not just simply a policy to drive down emissions. It can actually be an important metric for how we implement a system of transparency. It allows us to know that when we look at the price on carbon, a tax on carbon, price on allowances, or energy prices as well, it's giving us a sense of the effort that's being undertaken in countries. If we look at the change over time in those prices, it can give us a sense of how much they're ramping up their ambition and their domestic implementation over time. The market prices are observable. So there's this kind of appeal of transparency in the actual metric itself. It's not like I have to do a lot of analysis to figure out what is the carbon tax in a country. I just look at what's the tax being imposed on those who are covered by it. Or I look at the clearinghouse for allowances, or I look at allowance auctions, and I know what's the price on carbon in a cap-and-trade program. It also has this appeal of sort of sending these kinds of long-term investment incentives that are going to be important when we think about the long term of climate change, and recognizing here that we have a metric both for today, but that can also signal what we expect will be the nature of the effort in the future. Now, there are some challenges. Comparing prices in different currencies raise issues about the most effective way to convert through exchange rates. There's also a question, of course, that a lot of countries are not using just a carbon tax or cap and trade. They're using non-price policies. And so there's a question about how effective then a price on carbon is in a world with those kinds of policies. Let me close with a couple of comments about domestic transparency. Now, when we're pricing carbon, what we're really trying to do is change energy prices. We're changing relative energy prices to try to induce the use of more carbon lean or zero carbon energy technologies. But we're also raising the price of energy to drive conservation and energy efficiency. That's part of driving carbon abatement. So I've done a little work looking at the modeling analyses that were compiled in the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is, they pulled together a modeling results from a large number of model comparison exercises, including the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. Adele and her colleagues have participated in that a number of times, a number of the European exercises as well. And a lot of what they're doing is trying to model sort of a least cost stabilization scenario, which isn't strictly sort of an academic exercise. We see language referring to least cost pathways in the Paris Agreement itself. Part of it by saying we're not doing enough. When looking at current pledges, we're not doing enough when you look at the emissions pathway of these least cost scenarios. But there's a number of scenarios that said, what do we have to do to get to 2 degrees C, or at least get to 2 degrees C with a 50% probability? And one thing that comes out of this is that by 2030, more than a third, probably about 40% of our emissions abatement is because higher energy prices through carbon pricing will drive energy efficiency and conservation. This falls to about a third by 2050 on average. And so the problem with this is what's driving energy efficiency in these models. So I've worked in the government a couple of times. We don't like high energy prices when we're in government. You may recall a decade ago, in summer of 2008, gasoline prices got really high. We were having a debate about whether we should temporarily waive the federal gasoline tax as one way to deal with the high prices. There's been a lot of concern about in developing countries that if we price carbon, we're going to have high energy prices, and we don't like high energy prices. That's why we have fossil fuel subsidies. That was already been alluded to in Daniel's talk. So there's this challenge that these models say we want to have higher prices to drive energy efficiency. It's also part of what's going to be driving the fuel switching to lower and zero carbon technologies. But politically, that's really difficult. So about 2/3 of the world's population lives in an economy that either subsidizes fuels or electricity. And this is the state basically setting the price. And there's a lot of stickiness there. There have been some efforts in recent years to try to reform fossil fuel subsidies. I think we've seen some progress on that. The IMF has been pushing hard on this and a lot of their engagement with countries. Having said that, this year, as oil prices have started to creep back up again, we've seen a little bit of pulling back on subsidy reforms in a number of countries. But even when we look at carbon pricing design, sometimes the design of carbon pricing in practice isn't exactly how I would draw it up on a chalkboard when I'm back in the ivory tower in Cambridge. And what we end up with are sort of these sort of complicated systems that sometimes are intended to mute the price of energy. So part of that, we can think about the design of cap and trade. Some of the pilot projects in China, they had 7 pilot projects in provinces and cities that served as a sort of a learning process and a foundation for the national program that will be moving forward in the near term. But in those programs, electricity prices didn't adjust to the carbon price. The state set the price on electricity, and there was no price signal from the carbon price to consumers of electricity that might encourage them to become more efficient and conserve on their consumption of electricity. In California, in their cap and trade program, they are using auction value as they sell off emission allowances in their cap and trade program, giving it to utilities who are supposed to then pass that on to consumers to make sure that electricity rates are not going up. We see in carbon tax policy, sometimes we exempt some of the most energy-intensive consumers. We've seen this in some of the Northern European carbon tax policy programs. And then we also have a really complicated policy environment in many countries. So in the EU, we may have a cap-and-trade program, but we also have an array of other policies. Some like, say, subsidizing renewables. We've seen in California where they are very ambitious with cap-and-trade, but also a number of other policies to promote renewables, energy efficiency, et cetera. Overlapping these additional policies, especially with cap-and-trade, tends to decrease and drive down that allowance price. I would argue that in the past decade, the low EU allowance price, which has been below 10 euros for much of the past decade, was in part because of a slow-growing economy, but also because of a very ambitious push for renewables that meant at the end of the day, the cap-and-trade program was just sort of the cost of complying with the residual once you account for these other regulatory mandates and subsidies. And so the effect then is it may be really important in driving out, say, solar deployment in Germany, but it is weakening the price signal for investments in energy efficiency, and I think also weakening some of the price signals you want for investors who are thinking about the returns for long-term innovative technologies. So I think the challenges that we see this sort of political economy domestically is that we tend to like low costs. We sometimes like to see opaque costs. This is one reason why we've seen more of a preference, say, in the United States for command and control policies, regulatory approaches as opposed to market-based instruments. Politicians don't like to be held responsible for higher energy prices or the cost of new policies. There's also sometimes a Baptist and bootleggers problem here. So Bruce Yandel has written about this, the idea that you see this kind of convergence of interest among those who would be regulated, say in the business community, and say those in the environmental community, that you end up tailoring a certain kind of policy in a way that may get a sufficient coalition to support a policy, but it may be weakening some of the incentives we need. And sometimes we've seen this in the case of how some of the value associated with carbon pricing is being used to mute some of the price signals of those programs. And so the result is we end up with a kind of complicated policy landscape that I think risk undermining cost effectiveness. That may weaken our ability to become really ambitious. I think there's a decent argument to be said. The lower the cost of delivering a given emissions goal means we can strive for a more ambitious emissions goal. But as we tie up our climate policy in a more complicated policy framework, or sometimes I've heard about it as sort of a spaghetti framework or a pancake framework that gets used in a variety of contexts, that we end up making it difficult to really deliver on very ambitious goals. I think it may weaken the incentives for innovation because the really creative people thinking about the technologies of the future are not seeing sort of a high price signal that may signal high returns to their innovative activity. And so I think there's also a risk here that we may not be able to deliver on our really ambitious climate goals like 2 degrees C if we're not sending the right kind of price signals to take advantage of all our opportunities for reducing emissions, especially on the efficiency and conservation dimension. So with that, if you would like any of the information that I've presented here, feel free to email me, or you can also check out my website, and I look forward to our conversation after the panel. Thank you.
There's one up here. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Hopefully I can get this going. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the role of co-benefits in promoting the adoption of carbon taxes. And as my fellow panelists have said, co-benefits are the reduction that you get in local air pollution from a carbon tax because you're going to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. So the question that I want to ask is, how large a role are co-benefits likely to play in reducing carbon emissions? We know definitely that, sorry, I'm glad I brought these. It's hard for me to see exactly what's on the screen over there, sorry. But yes, we know that the health damages associated with fossil fuels are largely the health damages associated with coal, and this is a point actually that Ian made. And a carbon tax is a tax on coal. It's going to provide incentives for people to switch out of coal. It's going to cause lives to be saved. And I think that the IMF, in particular Ian's team, really deserves a lot of credit for quantifying these co-benefits and actually moving them into the international dialogue. The IMF has estimated the co-benefits of a carbon tax for India, and I'm going to look at their estimates and discuss them for my remarks. And I should say there was actually a paper that came out last year, Reforming Energy Policy in India, Assessing the Options, which really goes into great detail for India what Ian presented for all countries a few minutes ago. So, what does the IMF estimate to be the co-benefits of a carbon tax for India? They estimate that if you had a carbon tax that was $2.50 per ton of CO2 in 2017, and then it was ramped up to $35 per ton in 2030, which is really the $35 that Ian was talking about, this would save almost 500,000 lives over the 2017 to 2013 period. In particular, it would save 127,000 lives just in the year 2030 alone, when the tax reaches $35. The more surprising result, perhaps, is that according to the calculations, the IMF calculations, the carbon tax actually pays for itself in terms of these domestic environmental benefits. The cost of the tax in 2030 is about 4% of GDP, 0.4% rather of GDP, and the value of lives saved in 2030 is about 2% of GDP. So in other words, the carbon tax is really paying for itself in terms of reducing local pollution. So the questions that I want to ask are, is the magnitude of these co-benefits from the carbon tax for India, at least, believable? And this is going to hinge on the value of avoided premature mortality. It's going to hinge on the value of a statistical life. But I also want to raise the issue about what effect, should be effect instead of role, but what effect do stricter emission standards have on co-benefits? So in December of 2015, India issued very stringent emission standards for coal-fired power plants. They effectively require putting scrubbers, FGDs, to reduce SO2, selective catalytic reduction to reduce NOx, improved electrostatic precipitators. They would really make power plants in India as clean or cleaner than power plants in the United States. If you put these into the business as usual scenario, then this will reduce co-benefits. And if you were somebody who really cared primarily about local air pollution benefits, you were not particularly concerned about global benefits, then you might ask the question, is it cheaper to reduce deaths due to local pollution through these stringent emission standards or through a carbon tax? What is really the cheaper cost per life saved? So, to just review the magnitude of health damages from fossil fuels in India. Most of these health damages come from coal, and they are indeed measured by premature mortality. There are morbidity benefits, which we're not going to talk about today. The Global Burden of Disease team at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which annually publishes in The Lancet estimates of the health damages associated with outdoor air pollution, came out with a study in January of those damages for India and attributing them sector by sector. And I'm happy to say that the IMF estimates in the report I just cited actually agree very well with the global burden of disease estimates. The IMF estimates that 160,000 deaths were attributable to burning coal in India in 2015, and twice that number, 320,000, would be attributable to burning coal under a business as usual scenario. And the numbers for all fossil fuels are in parentheses, so in 2030, there would actually be 380,000 deaths due to all fossil fuels, and the carbon tax would eliminate about a third of those. The 127,000 is about a third of that. So the big question is, how should we value lives lost due to fossil fuels? The way an economist would do this is to say, fossil fuel reduction is going to, and the reduction in air pollution is going to reduce the risk of death by a small amount for many people. We're going to look at what people would be willing to pay to give up in terms of other consumption to reduce their risk of dying. The term that economists use for this is the value per statistical life. And as the slide says, this measures what, for example, 10,000 people would each pay to reduce their risk of dying over the coming year by 1 in 10,000. It's useful to think about the ratio of the value of a statistical life to per capita income. So if the value of a statistical life is 100 times per capita income, this implies that a person would pay 1% of their income to reduce their risk of dying by 1 in 10,000. If the VSL is 500 times per capita income, it means that a person would pay 5% of their income for the same risk reduction, the 1 in 10,000 over the coming year. Most people, I think, believe it's reasonable, and studies back this up, that as incomes go down, the percentage of your income you'd be willing to pay for this risk reduction should also go down. Or in other words, the ratio of the value of a statistical life to per capita income should decline as incomes decline. A poor person is going to spend a smaller percentage of their income on risk reductions than a wealthy person. Think about countries where people are spending 25% of their income on food or even 40% on food. They're going to spend a smaller percentage of their income on risk reductions than people in wealthy countries who are spending less than 10% of their income on food. So it turns out that the value of a statistical life used by the IMF implies a ratio of the value of a statistical life to income of about 500 to 1, which is large compared to international practice. So as the slide says, if you look at OECD practice, the ratio of the value of a statistical life to per capita income on average in OECD countries is 100. In the US, where we have a very high value of a statistical life, that ratio is about 160. In terms of what's reasonable for India, I'm not going to comment on that right now, but I think that it should be lower than 500, and if you went to the OECD ratio, that would reduce the value of co-benefits to 20% of their current value. Okay, so turning now to the new air pollution control standards for coal-fired power plants. So, 2 points. If you put these in the baseline, then of course business as usual emissions from coal go down, co-benefits will go down, and so I think the question is, how big would that effect be if that were actually calculated? But I think some people might also ask the question in the third bullet, that is, how does the cost per life saved from these emission standards, these very strict standards, compared with the cost per life saved? We're now just talking about the cost in terms of not what people would pay for it, but just the cost per life saved from a carbon tax. And the last bullet actually raises an issue that people often raise in terms of the impact of stricter emission standards for fossil fuels, that in the case of the electricity sector, what impact is this going to have on the price of electricity from coal plants? Is it going to make renewables more competitive with coal, or will it make them competitive with coal? So, there was a study that came out this summer by the Center for the Study of Science, Technology, and Policy, which is what CSTEP stands for. They are an NGO in Bangalore. It's actually a very careful study that does a plant-by-plant analysis using air quality modeling to look at the impact of current and future coal-fired power plants in India on air quality. And they look at the costs and benefits of a gradual phase-in of the very stringent standards for coal-fired power plants, phasing them in from 2018 rather till 2030. They estimate that 320,000 lives would be saved over this period, and the cost per life saved comes out to be about 14 million rupees. To put that in context, actually, if the VSL were 160 to 1, that would be about 16 million rupees. They also look at the impact that this would have on prices, electricity prices, and they estimate that these standards would raise the cost of electricity by 20 to 25%. The cost would still be under 4 rupees per kilowatt hour. Terry, the Energy Research Institute, estimates that renewables become competitive if the price of electricity from coal reaches 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation of the cost per life saved of the $35 CO2 tax in 2030. Again, this is from very rough calculations, and it comes out to be about 16 million rupees. So I'm going to just conclude here by saying, if we ask, what is the role for co-benefits in promoting carbon taxes in India? First of all, it is true that if the carbon tax were $35 per ton of CO2, which would be roughly $70 per ton of coal, or 4,600 rupees per ton of coal, that's more than the current delivered coal price. It's a large tax. As Ian showed, it would have a huge impact on CO2 emissions, and indeed it would, but it's something I think that requires some selling. I think it's hard to sell it based on co-benefits alone. I'm not saying that there aren't co-benefits, but I do think that there's an issue of how you're going to price the lives saved by the carbon tax, and I think it's important, assuming that the strict emission standards actually are going to be implemented, that they be incorporated in the baseline when you're calculating co-benefits. So I think co-benefits are important. I think it's important also to calculate them conservatively to make a convincing case.
Well, thanks very much, Maureen, and thank you to all of our speakers for their remarks. I'd like to just ask if any of you panelists have any thoughts or comments on any of the remarks of the other panelists. Anybody want to?
Well, just quickly in response to Maureen, I think you make very valid points on the valuation of mortality, and I think you've more or less convinced me that when we revise our estimates, we will take into account your recommendations for transferring these values to low-income countries, where it'll make a significant difference to our estimates, but not so much for countries that have more comparable incomes to those for advanced countries. And then just a little point on the emission rate. I mean, our calculations do allow for some declining emission rates over time, but it's a little bit tricky to judge to what extent these new emission rate standards will be fully enforced, and to what and how long it'll take for them to fully permeate the entire fleet of coal plants. In other words, how long will we have existing plants remain in business with a much higher emission rates?
No, first of all, it's a really valid point that there's been a lot of pushback on these emission standards. They were issued in December of 2015, then there was a 2-year extension of when they should be implemented. That's been pushed even more into the future, and I must say in the C-STEP study, they do assume that it's going to take, almost till 2030 for these to actually be enforced and for the equipment to be installed. I think it's still interesting from the perspective of just doing the calculation to see what difference it makes. But you're right, there is an issue here of whether people will really push for this. I mean, there have also been talks of trying to subsidize the upfront cost of pollution control devices, which is considerable. And so I think that politically there are going to be issues there too. I agree.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on Ian's presentation. I think it's really useful to develop tools to help countries understand the impacts of carbon pricing. The World Bank, through the Partnership for Market Readiness, works with a lot of the developing countries around the world who are either considering or implementing carbon pricing. And most of them do some form of impact assessment, and these can be quite influential. And it's important when doing these to think as broadly as possible about the benefits that can be included in these, and they often don't. There's not more work, and work like this can be really helpful in understanding what benefits can be included and how to quantify those benefits. And even how to do the underlying economic analysis. At the World Bank, we're rethinking how we do the modelling of the economic impacts of carbon pricing on output, employment, etc. Recognising that carbon pricing can be positive for economic development, particularly in developing countries which have large informal sectors, and carbon taxes and carbon pricing can be a relatively efficient way of raising revenue, which can then be spent on economic development. Another comment I'd make on co-benefits is we're doing some research at the moment, and we'll put out a guidebook towards the end of the year under the Partnership for Market Readiness on communicating carbon pricing. And interestingly, the research we've done for that has shown that in talking about carbon pricing and selling carbon pricing and communicating it, it's often the co-benefits unrelated to climate change that are the most successful in helping to get carbon pricing through. And we've seen some examples of countries that do that. For example, Chile brought through their carbon tax as part of a package of broader environmental reforms where a lot of the narrative was around air pollution and not so much about climate change.
Very good. So I'll throw out a question. Now, this is for Joe. So we've heard both Daniel and Ian talk about this disconnect between the observed carbon prices and the carbon prices that would be consistent with a trajectory to 2 degrees. And in full disclosure, I sat on that high-level commission on carbon pricing. And so that $40 to $80 per ton of CO2 that Ian was talking about by 2020 is global, and it also assumes a complementary set of regulatory policies such as land use and agriculture and a number of other domestic policies that we're also not seeing, right? So Joe, now you talk about the political economy. I would love to hear how you think about, the transparency of the economic reality of 2 degrees, and how should we be talking about our stabilization goals at this point?
It's clear when you look at the integrated assessment models, it's a very ambitious target. Some of these models need penetration of technologies that don't exist today, technologies that are actually negative emission technologies in the energy sector, which requires a lot of creativity just to imagine that for your model, but then a lot more creativity to think about how you might actually build and engineer something like that. I think it's also clear that when we look at the international negotiations, it took a long time to have any kind of quantitative goal for the international climate process. So we had it in 1992 in the Earth Summit in Rio, agreement on what is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and had this rather qualitative objective for the world on we were going to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the global climate. And it really wasn't until 2009 that we had any kind of characterization in any kind of international agreement, in this case in the Copenhagen Accord, that said we got to try to limit warming to 2 degrees C. And the island states push hard to have some 1.5 degrees C language. And so you've seen since then this sort of back and forth between 1.5 or 2 or well below 2 degrees C. But as soon as you had an agreement on 2 degrees C, no one wanted to, well, I shouldn't say no one. There were certain key countries that did not want to talk about how you might divide up that 2 degrees C. In fact, they didn't even want to say, here's what the developed countries. In fact, there was debate in Copenhagen on the last day, which was like a 48-hour day, of whether the developed countries could put in their goal, like the G7 countries or the OECD countries, say, here's what we're going to do to reduce our emissions by 2050. And some of the developing countries said no. Because if you have that and you have a 2 degrees C goal, we're the residual, and we think you need to be doing more than that. So they didn't even want other countries to have a long-term goal. So I think there is this kind of challenge we face at the end of the day of how we're going to be, both at the multilateral level, how we're going to be allocating the effort, or really the cost of driving down these emissions. We know the emissions have to come down in the developing world. Developed countries' emissions can go to 0 tomorrow and stay that way through the end of the century, and we're still going to blow beyond 2 degrees C. unless we have major emission reductions in developing countries. But the question is how we're going to drive the investment. There's going to be a continued push on who's sort of bearing the cost of that. But I think it's that kind of problem that also plagues a lot of our domestic policies, where the cost potentially of reducing emissions are going to be quite concentrated. I mean, I've looked at a number of analyses for India as well. I mean, in some sense, it's like it should be a no-brainer to have some kind of carbon tax in that country because of public health benefits. Maybe not $35 a ton. Maybe the benefits start to diminish some there. But the analyses make it clear that you can get significant emission reductions of CO2 with significant co-benefits, but those costs are going to be concentrated, especially with coal in India, but in other countries as well where we know that's a concern, where the public health benefits, the co-benefits, are going to be a lot more dispersed, and sort of the challenge of getting people to rally around those is difficult. The last thing I would say is, while I, of course, think that pricing carbon would be an elegant approach, and it's what I teach, and it's what I love, is the prospect of pricing carbon, there have been some benefits to sort of subsidizing some of the competitive technologies and building business sector support. I mean, in a world in which you now have really large numbers of workers, so you've engaged the labor movement and manufacturers in the wind and solar industries, I think have changed the political economy of how we tackle carbon emissions in the power sector. I think the technological advances in natural gas have changed the political dynamic in the power sector as well. So part of this, when I think about the political economy, is how do you broaden the coalition and bring more people on the business side to sort of support and have them sort of be meaningful enough politically to support these more ambitious policies. And I think that's the real test, is whether over the next decade we can really see that kind of ramping up of ambition.
Very good. Anybody else have any other thoughts before I open it up to the audience? Okay, so now we turn to the final part of our event, and I welcome your questions and thoughts. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Please introduce yourself and frame your question in the form of a question.
I will try my best. So, Céline Caro, good morning. I'm with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This is a German political foundation affiliated with the party of Chancellor Merkel. And my question is about the United States. How is the country doing regarding the mitigation pledges? What would you say in general? Is the US delivering despite the current political climate at the federal level? And in this regard, how important is the contribution of the different states in the US? Thank you very much.
I'll say this. For 2020, I think you're going to see the U.S.'s emissions being quite close to what it pledged in 2009 in Copenhagen and repeated again in 2010 in Cancun. Right now, we see power sector emissions in the U.S. are about 25% below their 2005 levels, and that's what's really driving a lot of the reduction in emissions. The 2025 goal, I think, is tough without new policies, and I don't expect there to be new policies in the next few years. So at the federal level, and so it's going to depend on the states. And we're seeing California continue to push quite aggressively in this way. I think we've seen this as well in some of the Northeast states. I think it's enough to keep, in a world in which you're going to see either rolling back, say, on fuel economy standards, or failure to really implement anything that's sort of meaningfully aggressive or ambitious in the power sector in terms of emission standards from the federal government. I think the actions from the states are going to keep U.S. emissions from increasing. But I don't think between now and 2025 is going to be enough to deliver on what was the pledge for Paris in 2015.
But another issue is to what extent are the feedback effects of the U.S. Position on making it more difficult for other countries to move ahead with aggressive policies, like presumably it's more difficult for Canada to meet its carbon price floor. There'll be more pressure to slacken it. Perhaps it's more difficult for Mexico to move ahead with an aggressive pricing system.
I think that is a real risk, that we'll potentially see, if not sort of a rolling back of the initial round of pledges, but less ambition in the second round of pledges. And a kind of, I think, frustration among some of the international negotiators of the kind of yo-yo from U.S. policy over the last 20 or so years in this context. So there is that risk. There's also the long-term risk, which is we'll end up making fewer investments in the near term in R&D, that's necessary to have sort of lower cost technologies that make it easier to establish more ambitious pledges and domestic policies in the longer term. So I think there's a longer term persistent effect that could also be adverse in addition to this sort of peer effect with other countries.
I want to add just one slightly optimistic note, though, is, those who are deploying long-lived capital have their eye on a longer-term ball that I think the smart money is not going to be on high-carbon energy. And so, yes, we may have at this moment a lack of policy or the rolling back of policy, and perhaps that has repercussions in the policy stringency abroad. But I think the long run is that, this issue's not going to go away, and we are going to need that technology, and you don't want to have your long-lived investment in high carbon in the United States or elsewhere if that's going to just be scrapped prematurely. So I think, capital markets are paying attention to this issue in a way they haven't in the past. So, we'll see how it goes. Okay, yes, sir, here in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Adam Hauser, and a question for really anybody to chime in on. Could you provide any insight as to why U.S. CO2 emissions seem to have been going down according to AEI research published in July, leading the world in decreasing CO2 emissions? Any insight as to why that is despite not signing on to Paris or having a carbon tax, and how that compares to global CO2 emissions as a whole? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, power sector emissions are down a quarter since 2005, about 15 percentage points. About 60% of that is natural gas displacing coal, and about 10 percentage points is wind and solar penetration. And wind and solar, almost all that investment, you could say, was leveraged by policy. It's hard to imagine much of the investment in wind and solar over the past decade would have happened in the absence of both federal and state policies. So even though we don't have a carbon tax, the Clean Power Plan was stayed before we now have the proposal for a weaker version from the EPA. You still have, I think, policies that have helped contribute to that. I think on the fuel economy side, you've seen a ramping up of fuel economy that matters and driving down, or at least slowing the growth in transportation sector emissions. So I think those are all contributing factors to how we've seen emissions in the U.S. decline. But it's also, our friends on the other coast are really doing stuff. So, California is being quite ambitious with their policies as well. So I think some of the state actions play an important role here as well.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I am James Taylor.
Oh, wait for the microphone if you would. Thank you.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, Senior Fellow with the Heartland Institute. The underlying assumption here seems to be that the Paris Agreement should be implemented, yet AEI resident scholar Ben Zeiker wrote in a column last year, he documented very high costs and very little temperature impact from the Paris Agreement. He wrote, "Is there a plausible reason that the U.S. should remain a party to this charade? No, obviously." So my question is, what has changed during the past year to nullify this AEI scholar's observation?
I don't think there was a consensus with that observation a year ago. So I don't know if I need evidence in the past year to challenge it. That when I look at what the international community is trying to do and trying to take a more collaborative and truly universal approach. The approach 2 decades earlier in Kyoto was focused on just the developed countries. We saw significant emissions growth in developing countries after the signing of the Kyoto Agreement. We needed to have a much more expansive approach. We've seen countries come forward with voluntary pledges to say, here's what we're trying to do and what we're going to do. I think there's a real risk with trying to say, what is the temperature change from any agreement covering a 5-year period, when what we need to do is deliver significant change over the course of the century. And there's questions that people will have in how they run their models on sort of how much is this going to affect climate change, and how much, if we fail to address climate change, is that going to impact life here in the U.S. or around the world? My view on this, when I hear people sort of arguing on the science, as someone who's not a scientist, is to say, I don't care. I know enough to know that in a world of uncertainty, and where the risks are irreversible, there is an economic case that's built on economic theory going back 40 years to some of Ken Arrow's work, so like a pretty good economist thinking about this issue, that when we face this kind of uncertainty and the impacts are irreversible, it makes sense for us to make certain kinds of investments to avoid that irreversibility. So in a world in which the downside on climate change looks kind of bad, but I don't know with certainty, that's not enough for me to say, well, I'm going to hold off until I have certainty. It's enough to justify taking some actions now that keep options open and keep doors open. So I take a very different approach than your colleague on this, and how I interpret the risk posed by climate change and how that should motivate the policy response.
Maureen, you probably know more than any of us about the latest thinking on the social cost of carbon, because you co-chaired that work by the national academies on this topic. Do you want to chime in a little bit on the contention that reducing emissions has virtually no benefit?
So first of all, I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but I would say that if you're interested in looking at certainly the latest on the social cost of carbon, I would go to the website of the Climate Impact Lab at the University of Chicago and look at the most recent research really on climate damages. What this National Academy report did, which was co-chaired by Richard Newell and myself, was actually to talk about how the federal government, they actually requested the study under the Obama administration, how they should go about calculating the social cost of carbon. So we did have climate scientists who indicated exactly how the climate module of the analysis should be structured. We talked about the need to improve damage estimates and actually made some suggestions along those lines. I think clearly this is not happening under the current administration, but if you do look at the Climate Impact Lab and also actually work that's going on at Resources for the Future to implement some of the recommendations of the study, I think that would give you, some insight into what is the current state of thinking. And I actually think that the Climate Impact Lab is actually planning to come out with their estimates of the social cost of carbon, I believe certainly within the next year, and they certainly in their article in Science a year ago certainly looked at damages for the U.S. under various RCPs.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I think it's fair to say we can just incorporate by reference the work of the National Academies and the University of Chicago and all the other fine scholars in this field in response to Mr. Zeiker's view. Yes, Mr. Detchen.
Hi, I'm Reed Detchen with the UN Foundation. Let the economists have a couple of questions here. I have a question about the value of economic modeling for these exercises, particularly with regard to the induced innovation that occurs when you change price signals. I think if we had looked at economic modeling 5 years ago and projected the cost of change based on what we understood to be the cost of renewable energy, it would have been very expensive. And now it looks very cheap, if not positive. So obviously, if you set a price signal, particularly with a long-term price signal, you're going to induce investment and innovation. But none of that benefit shows up in models, not to mention the co-benefits that Maureen was talking about. So how can we use economic models in a better way to understand that the changes that will be induced may end up A, reducing the costs, and B, increase the benefits, such that people will say, well, this is a better world regardless of whether we get the climate benefits?
Well, I can take that at least in part because I work very closely with a modeling team, and I was a co-chair of our recent Stanford Energy Modeling Forum project, number 32, on U.S. greenhouse gas emission scenarios, including carbon taxes. And one of the challenges for modelers is how do you incorporate technologies that don't exist yet? How do you parameterize those models? And so I think what we tend to do is try illustrative sensitivity scenarios. So let's just suppose that technologies develop and become less costly to reduce emissions. How does that change the projections of the model in terms of emissions reductions for a given carbon price or the cost to the economy of a particular abatement policy? But this is an intrinsic limitation because we don't have a crystal ball. But what we can do is historical look at how technological, whether it's technology policy or relative price changes, how those have induced lower costs of technologies. And so I think there's a variety of tools that may not be modeling tools, but maybe event analyses, historical analyses that shed light on how these things have evolved in past situations. I think it's important to recognize the possibility that some technologies won't evolve. We had a cellulosic biofuel standard that, relied on the evolution of a technology that didn't mature at scale the way some of the optimists for that policy thought they would. And so I think we have to be humble when we make policy about assuming that a certain technology is going to be available. But certainly I hope with the price on carbon, we create the incentives, the right incentives for capital markets to incentivize these technologies in the most efficient way possible. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Thank you. My name is Olivia Hipkins. I work at IFC. I also volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby. One of the things that we're talking about in DC right now is increasing the renewable portfolio standards. I know they've already done it in Hawaii as well as California just recently. I was just curious how that would interact with a carbon pricing policy. DC's talking about going to 100% renewables by 2032. How would that affect the efficacy of carbon pricing?
Part of it depends on how you design the carbon pricing. It's a very big difference if it's a carbon tax versus cap and trade. So if you were to overlay a renewable portfolio standard mandating that so much of your power has to come from renewable sources, and you had a carbon tax, you get an economist like me question the cost effectiveness of that, but you would be getting emission reductions from both instruments. Whereas if you had cap and trade and you put, that which is setting a cap, the target on your emissions, and you layered on an aggressive renewable portfolio standard, then you could very well be in a world in which you put on this renewable portfolio standard and not had a change in your emissions at all if the cap and trade is still binding. So I think it's going to depend on, when we say carbon pricing, which instrument we choose matters a lot for those impacts. And I think there's also a question too when you think about these instruments at very local levels or state levels. How well, especially with a power grid, there's also a concern about leakage. This is an issue that California has thought a lot about. It's an issue some of the RGGI states, the Northeast states that have cap and trade, which is the prospect when you have at a more local scale cap and trade markets that overlay imperfectly with power markets, there's a possibility that you're just sort of shifting around in that power market where the low carbon energy is being delivered and where the higher carbon energy is being consumed that's not covered by the climate instrument. So I think that's an important consideration too for the district.
So we have time for one more question. We had one over here.
Good morning, Joseph Mikett from the Niskanen Center. Daniel, I was really interested in this graph or the chart that you showed of kind of carbon prices throughout the world. And you get sort of a positive picture, so there's a lot of countries that light up various colors. But then $33 billion of carbon revenue is less than 0.05% of GDP. And world tax burdens are something like 10 or 15% of global GDP. So when we think about using carbon pricing as a compliance mechanism for like the Paris Climate Agreement or a 2°C world, how much does carbon pricing become part of like a real fiscal conversation when we think about how the world creates government revenue? Like where are we between 0.05 and where we think we need to be in terms of what carbon pricing should look like as a fiscally?
Thanks. Well, we certainly know that to get the levels of mitigation that we need, carbon prices need to be a lot higher, coverage needs to be broader, and there probably needs to be a reduction in sort of the allocation to a lot of firms, so a higher effective carbon price that they're facing. But in terms of the extent to which carbon pricing is a fiscal conversation, we're certainly seeing that arise in developing countries where, for example, a lot of the work we've been doing in Africa where emissions aren't that high, but their interest in carbon pricing is because it's a relatively efficient form of raising revenue. So, for example, Ivory Coast at the moment is considering developing a carbon tax, and its main motivation is fiscal reform, is to improve its revenue raising and the efficiency of its tax system. So it's certainly an important measure, and what we're finding is particularly in developing countries.
Well, very good. Thank you, Daniel. And please join me in thanking our panelists for this, for their remarks. And thank you again, Aparna, for your kind hosting of this event.